A Navy SEAL came to the mountains for silence. Then winter snow revealed 2 German Shepherd K9s, bound and half buried, breaths fading. When he cut the ropes, a sharp chemical smell rose, something he'd known in war zones. Saving them opened a covert ring, betrayal, and a fight for justice. And love. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from. And if this story moves you, don't forget to subscribe for more. Cedar Vale, Wyoming, lay hushed beneath a winter sky the color of steel. Dawn came slowly here, filtered through clouds heavy with snow, turning the small mountain town into a muted sketch of roofs, chimneys, and frozen streets. Wind pushed loose powder across Main Street, erasing footprints almost as soon as they formed. Beyond the last row of houses, the wilderness rose. Dense pine forest climbing into the mountains, silent and indifferent. Miles from town, where the road narrowed into a single snow-packed track, stood a solitary log cabin. It belonged to Evan Hale. Evan was 29, tall and lean, with the balanced build of someone who had spent years training his body to obey without question. His dark hair was cropped short, his face clean-shaven, features sharp but calm. There was an alertness in his eyes that never fully faded, a mark left by years as a Navy SEAL. He was on extended leave after a long overseas deployment, sent away not for punishment, but for recovery. Cedar Vale offered isolation, and Evan had chosen it deliberately. That morning, before the sun reached the ridge, Evan stepped outside to check the woodpile. The cold struck hard, biting through his jacket. Snow creaked beneath his boots. He paused halfway across the clearing, a familiar unease settling in his chest. Something was wrong. Near the tree line, half buried in a drift, were 2 dark shapes. Evan's posture shifted instantly. He moved closer, careful and quiet. As he brushed snow aside, his breath caught. 2 German shepherds lay tangled together, their legs bound tightly with thick gray cord. Frost clung to their fur. Their bodies were rigid with cold, breaths shallow and uneven. One barely stirred. They were close to death. Evan dropped to his knees. His movements were swift but controlled. Checking airways, brushing snow from muzzles, pressing gloved fingers to feel for faint pulses. The dogs were powerful even in their weakened state, their build unmistakable, working animals, trained, disciplined. He examined the bindings. The cord wasn't rope or twine, it was industrial restraint line, the kind used to secure heavy cargo or chemical containers. Too strong, too uniform to be improvised. He drew a knife and cut through the cord, freeing their legs. As the bindings fell away, a faint scent rose from the snow. Evan inhaled again, slower this time. Chemical, sharp, metallic. It wasn't a smell he could name outright, but it was one he recognized, a trace he had encountered before in places where regulations didn't apply and experiments crossed lines. Illicit stimulants, dangerous compounds, nothing that belonged in the open forest. "Easy," he murmured, his voice low. As he lifted the nearer dog, he noticed the collar, or rather, what was missing from it. A section of leather had been sliced cleanly, the small plastic housing torn away. A K9 identification tracker, or service module, removed deliberately. These dogs hadn't wandered into trouble. They had been abandoned. Evan carried them back to the cabin one at a time, muscles straining under their weight. Inside, warmth wrapped around them. Firelight flickered across timber walls as Evan laid the dogs near the hearth, covering them with blankets. He worked methodically, rubbing circulation back into stiff limbs, monitoring breathing, keeping their core temperature rising. Minutes stretched into nearly an hour. 1 dog. Night, as Evan would later learn, slipped into deeper sleep, breathing steadier. The other stirred sooner. Sable's eyes opened slowly, dark and alert despite the pain. She didn't growl or resist. Instead, she turned her head toward the cabin door. She watched it intently. Evan noticed a quiet tension settling in his shoulders. Sable rose unsteadily and pressed her nose near the wood, ears twitching as if listening for something beyond the walls. Someone, perhaps. In Cedar Vale, the morning carried on as usual, unaware of what lay beyond its borders. At the edge of town, Nora Jennings stood in the back room of the Cedar Vale Animal Clinic. In her late 50s, she carried herself with the calm authority of long experience. Her hair, streaked with gray, was tied back neatly. Her eyes were sharp, thoughtful, and kind in a way that came from decades of caring for creatures that couldn't explain their pain. On the stainless steel table lay a young pronghorn antelope. There were no signs of predation, no torn flesh. Nora frowned as she examined the body more closely. Just behind the shoulder, she found it. A tiny puncture mark, easy to miss. She took samples carefully. The liver tissue showed abnormal damage, cellular breakdown inconsistent with disease or known toxins. This was the third animal that week. Later, she sat across from Sheriff Cole Maddox in his office. Maddox was broad-shouldered, early 40s, with the worn look of a man who had carried responsibility for too long. His badge caught the light as he scanned Nora's notes. "These animals were injected," Nora said, keeping her voice steady. "Whatever compound this is, it's not approved for veterinary use. It's doing serious internal damage." Cole sighed and leaned back. "I'm not saying you're wrong, but wildlife deaths fall under state control. I'll forward this to Wildlife Services." "And if it's not just wildlife?" Nora pressed. He met her gaze, conflicted but firm. "Then we'll deal with it when there's proof." Nora left with unease settling deep in her chest. Night returned early in the mountains. Snow tapped softly against Evan's windows as darkness closed in. He sat on the floor beside the fire, watching the dogs. Night slept. Sable remained awake, eyes fixed on the door, body tense despite exhaustion. Evan followed her gaze. Whatever had happened in the forest wasn't finished. It was waiting. Morning broke pale and cold, the forest wrapped in a brittle silence. Night moved first, rising from the cabin floor with a stiffness that betrayed the night he had endured. He tested his weight, then lowered his head and sniffed the air near the threshold. His tail lifted once, decisive. Evan watched, reading the posture the way he would read terrain. This wasn't restlessness. It was direction. Outside, the snow was unbroken, except for faint disturbances the wind hadn't erased. Night followed them with a certainty that pulled Evan forward, deeper between the pines. The dog's nose stayed low, tracking something subtle and persistent beneath the clean winter scent. Sable followed close behind, alert, her ears pivoting with each distant creak of timber. They found her near a shallow ravine where the trees thinned and the wind cut sharper. Riley Hart was propped against a fallen log, wrapped in a dark tactical jacket, dusted white. She rose as they approached, careful not to put full weight on her left leg. She was in her early 30s, athletic, with chestnut hair pulled into a tight braid that had begun to unravel. A shallow cut marked her temple. Dried blood traced a thin line down her cheek. Her eyes, clear, assessing, unmistakably federal. Locked on Evan first, then softened when they dropped to the dogs. Sable. Night. Her voice was steady, but it cost her something to keep it that way. She knelt, ignoring the protest in her knee, and the dogs closed the distance at once. Night pressed his head into her shoulder. Sable leaned in, breath trembling. Riley closed her eyes briefly, anchoring herself in the contact before she looked back up. "I'm Riley Hart," she said. "FBI." Evan gave a short nod. "Evan Hale." She clocked him quickly. The stance, the way he held his hands. "Military." "SEAL," he said, equally brief. Riley exhaled, a fraction of relief passing through her posture. She eased back against the log and explained without drama, as if reciting a field report. 2 nights earlier, she had been working alone, moving quietly along a corridor of forest roads used after dark. The group she was tracking called itself the Black Timber Syndicate. They operated like professionals. Tight cells, clean movements, little chatter. Her job had been to identify a transfer point. "They're testing a banned neural stimulant on K9s," she said, "a variant designed to push aggression and endurance past control. The idea is to sell the dogs to buyers who don't care what happens after deployment." Evan listened, eyes on the tree line. "They hit me after sunset," Riley continued. 6 of them. They knew where I'd be. Took the dogs. I broke contact when the storm rolled in." She paused, then met Evan's gaze. "I lost them in the whiteout. Stayed low, stayed alive." Evan told her about the cord, the missing tracker housing, the faint chemical scent he'd noticed. Riley's jaw tightened. "That's the compound," she said. "I couldn't prove it yet, but that smell, sharp, metallic, matches what we pulled from a lab site out of state." Knight lifted his head at her voice, ears angling toward the woods again. Riley followed his attention. "They were here," she said. "Recently." Back in Cedar Vale, the clinic lights burned long past noon. Nora Jennings sealed her samples with practiced care and logged them for transport. Her hands were steady, but her expression wasn't. She drove the specimens herself to the courier drop, then sat at her desk and stared at the phone until it rang. Cheyenne's number flashed on the screen. The lab technician spoke carefully, choosing each word. The compound present in the liver tissue wasn't environmental. It was synthetic, restricted. A close chemical match, 98%, to a stimulant under federal scrutiny for animal testing violations. Nora closed her eyes. "So it wasn't an accident?" "No," the technician said, "and it's not isolated." She thanked him and hung up, the pieces clicking together with a weight that settled in her chest. She picked up her coat and headed for the sheriff's office. Sheriff Cole Maddox stood by the window when she arrived, watching a snowplow crawl past. He turned as she entered, his expression guarded. "I've got confirmation," Nora said. "Those animals weren't poisoned by runoff. They were injected. The compound is illegal. Federal level, illegal." Cole rubbed a hand over his jaw. Before he could answer, the radio on his desk crackled. A deputy reported sightings of heavy trucks moving after midnight along the old forestry road north of town. Roads that had been closed since the first storms. Cole straightened. "That road's supposed to be dead." Nora met his eyes. "It isn't." In the forest, Riley pushed herself to her feet. "I need to move," she said. "They'll circle back." Evan studied the terrain, then the sky. "Cabin's defensible," he said. "Short distance." Riley hesitated, then nodded. Trust, earned quickly and without ceremony. They moved with care, Knight leading, Sable guarding the rear. At the cabin, Riley accepted water and a clean bandage, wincing only once as Evan set it in place. She watched his hands, precise and unassuming. "I didn't expect help," she said quietly. Evan glanced up. "You found it." Knight stood at the window again, low growl vibrating in his chest. Not a warning yet, but close. Riley followed his gaze into the trees. "They won't stop," she said. "Not now." Evan met her eyes. "Neither will we." The forest tightened around them as the light thinned. Snow fell in a fine, persistent veil, muting sound and depth alike. Sable moved with quiet confidence, her body angled forward, while Knight worked the ground with disciplined patience. Evan read their rhythm instinctively. This wasn't a wandering trail. It was a line. They reached a shallow rise where the land dipped unnaturally, the trees arranged as if to hide a scar. Beneath a crust of snow, a steel hatch lay flush with the earth, its edges rimmed with ice. Evan brushed the surface clean. The metal was cold, old, and used. Inside, the air changed, stale, chemical, trapped. The ladder descended into a narrow corridor reinforced with timber and corrugated steel. Evan took point, Riley close behind him, her movements careful but steady. Sable and Knight followed, paws silent on the rungs. The space opened into a low-ceilinged chamber lit by a single work lamp, left on too long. What they found told a story without words. A table lay cluttered with paper. Maps marked in grease pencil, arrows cutting through the forest like veins. Evan spread them flat. The routes weren't random. They threaded through service roads and seasonal closures, avoiding cameras and ranger stations. Smuggling paths, designed to breathe only at night. Along the far wall, steel kennels lined up in pairs. The floors were scored and worn. Industrial restraint line, identical to what Evan had cut away in the snow, hung coiled on hooks. Bowls sat overturned, ice cracked at their rims. Riley crossed to a shelf and stopped. Her fingers hovered, then closed around a small vial. The label was stark, printed in block letters, MK12. She didn't open it. She didn't need to. "That's it," she said quietly. "The compound." Evan glanced at her. "You're sure?" She nodded once. "The coding matches what we've been chasing. Same batch logic." Pinned to a corkboard near the exit were photographs. Surveillance shots taken from a distance, grainy, deliberate. Riley in a parking lot, Riley at the edge of the forest, Riley refueling late at night. Her jaw tightened. "They were watching me," she said. Knight lifted his head then, body stiffening. His ears angled toward the back corridor. He moved slowly, nose high, then froze. A low sound left his chest, not a growl of warning, but recognition. Riley felt it before she understood it. "What is it?" Evan followed Knight's line, scanning the shadows. "He's picked up a familiar scent." Knight's tail held steady. The air seemed to press closer. Riley's breath hitched. The name came unbidden, heavy with memory. Ford Mercer. She said it like a fact she could no longer avoid. Mercer had been her mentor at the Bureau, tall, precise, silvered at the temples, with an even voice that inspired confidence. He had taught her how to read rooms, how to trust patterns over instincts when the stakes were high. He had signed off on her early assignments. He had believed in her. Knight's reaction left no space for doubt. Riley's knees weakened. She caught herself against the table, eyes closing for a heartbeat that stretched too long. When she opened them, the shock had settled into something harder. Evan didn't speak. He stepped closer. Not crowding, not touching, just present. It was enough. Riley straightened, shoulders squaring. "Whatever he is now," she said, steadying her voice, "he made his choice." They sealed the hatch behind them and marked the location, the cold biting deeper as they climbed back into the open. The truth had weight, and it followed them out. Across Cedar Vale, Nora Jennings stood at the forest's edge with a soil auger and sample bags tucked under her arm. The land here felt wrong, too quiet, too bare. She drove the auger into the ground and pulled up a core streaked with a faint, oily sheen. The smell was unmistakable now. She worked methodically, taking multiple samples, mapping the gradient. The contamination spread outward in a slow fan, carried by meltwater and gravity. She traced the flow downhill, following the land's subtle tilt, until the pattern pointed to a single place on her map, Frostline Mine. It had been dormant for years, sealed and forgotten. Nora stared at the name, the implications settling in. An underground system would explain the spread. An outlet. A pipe. She sealed the last bag and headed back, resolve tightening with each step. Sheriff Cole Maddox noticed the SUV at dusk. Matte black, parked too far back from the road to be accidental. When he shifted position, it shifted too, not close enough to be overt, close enough to be deliberate. Cole took a longer route home, testing turns. The SUV mirrored him once, then peeled away. At his kitchen table, he set his badge down and stared at it longer than usual. Cedar Vale had always been simple. Tonight, it felt watched. In the cabin, Evan spread the maps again while Riley logged notes by lantern light. Sable lay near the door, alert but calm. Knight rested his head on his paws, eyes open. Riley paused, pen hovering. "This doesn't end at a kennel," she said. "It never does." Evan met her gaze. "Then we keep going." Outside, the wind carried snow through the trees, settling over the forest as if to bury what had been uncovered. The storm arrived without mercy. By mid-afternoon, Cedar Vale disappeared behind curtains of white. Wind howled through the valley, bending pines until they groaned like living things. Roads closed, power lines sagged. Sheriff Cole Maddox ordered evacuations where he could, but the blizzard moved faster than sirens. By nightfall, the town was isolated, cut off, silent, vulnerable. And someone had been waiting for exactly this moment. At Evan Hale's cabin, the world beyond the windows had dissolved into spinning snow. Inside, the air was tense but controlled. Evan moved with calm precision, sleeves rolled up, dark hair damp with melting flakes. Tall and athletic, his presence carried the quiet confidence of a man shaped by discipline rather than fear. His eyes, clear, focused, never stopped measuring distance and sound. He set the first alarm with fishing line and a string of empty shell casings, suspended low between two trees. Another line curved wide, designed to funnel movement toward a narrow drift where footprints would betray intent. He sculpted the snow with deliberate care, turning nature into misdirection. Riley Hart stood near the hearth, jacket zipped to her chin. Her auburn hair was braided tight, keeping it out of her face. Her expression was hard, controlled, the look of an agent who had already grieved and moved on to resolve. Sable lay near her boots, watchful. Knight paced once, then settled by the back wall, ears rotating. "They'll come tonight," Riley said. Evan nodded. "Blizzard gives them cover, and urgency." A low crunch sounded beyond the tree line. Knight's head snapped up. Sable rose, muscles coiling. Evan lifted a hand. "Wait." The first alarm sang softly, metal tapping metal. Evan's jaw tightened. He shifted, drawing Riley back into the shadowed side of the cabin as the second alarm rang. Closer now. Then the voice came, carried thinly through the wind. "Riley?" She froze. The doorframe creaked as a tall figure stepped into the spill of moonlight. Ford Mercer stood with practiced ease, coat dusted white, gray hair plastered to his temples. His face was familiar, sharp, controlled, but the warmth it once held was gone. His eyes were colder now, assessing, transactional. "You should have stayed buried," Mercer said. Riley's voice didn't shake. "You taught me better than that?" Mercer smiled faintly. "I taught you to survive. This is survival." Shots cracked through the night. Evan moved before the second muzzle flash. He kicked the rear latch, plunging the cabin into darkness as snow exploded through the front window. He rolled, firing once, not to kill, but to disrupt. Outside, curses followed. He pulled the cord on a buried line. The bells rang violently now, echoing through the storm. Shapes stumbled, disoriented. One man went down hard in the drift Evan had carved earlier, swearing as he sank waist-deep. Sable lunged through the shattered window with a snarl, teeth flashing. Night followed, a blur of black and sable, slamming into a second attacker with trained force. They didn't bite blindly. They drove, pinned, redirected. Instinct sharpened by purpose. Riley covered the rear, firing controlled shots that forced the remaining figures to scatter. Evan emerged from the side door, using the whiteout to vanish and reappear, ghosting between trees. He struck fast, disarming, disabling, never lingering. Mercer retreated, eyes burning as he watched his plan fracture. He raised his weapon toward Riley. Knight intercepted. The dog hit Mercer's arm hard enough to knock the shot wide, jaws locking just long enough for Riley to shove Mercer back into the snow. He fell, stunned, but not captured. Another blast of wind swallowed him as he was dragged away by his men. The silence afterward felt unreal. Evan grabbed Riley's arm. "We leave now." They didn't take the road. Evan led them through a narrow ravine hidden behind the cabin, a path he'd memorized over weeks. Snow erased their trail as they moved, the dogs flanking instinctively. Behind them, the cabin burned, not with fire, but with intent left unfulfilled. Far from the gunfire, Nora Jennings knelt in the snow beside a collapsed wolf. The animal's ribs showed beneath its gray coat, breath shallow, eyes glassy. Nora, short, sturdy, her lined face marked by years of field work, worked quickly. She injected fluids, wrapped the animal in thermal cloth, and whispered reassurances it couldn't understand but seemed to feel. The toxin was stronger here. Concentrated. She took samples, hands shaking, not from cold, but from anger. At her truck, she called Sheriff Maddox. "It's worse than we thought. They're poisoning the forest itself." Cole didn't hesitate. "I'm calling Federal Environmental Enforcement and the Bureau. I'll back you." As Evans' group crested the ridge overlooking Frostline Mine, the storm eased just enough to reveal lights below. Trucks idling, men moving with urgency. Riley stared down at it, breath fogging. "That's the last shipment." Evans set his jaw. "Then this ends tonight." The wind rose again, as if agreeing. The Frostline Mine lay hollowed into the mountainside like a wound that refused to close. Floodlights cut harsh cones through the falling snow, illuminating trucks backed into position and men moving with rushed efficiency. The storm had thinned to a hard, glittering cold, the kind that carried sound farther than expected. Evan Hale lay prone along a rocky shelf above the access road, breath steady, muscles relaxed, but ready. Snow dusted his dark hair and the shoulders of his jacket, but his eyes were sharp, tracking movement below. Youth gave his face an effortless confidence. Clean lines, calm focus. But there was nothing soft about the way he assessed angles and timing. Beside him, Sable crouched low, ears forward, every sense locked on the activity below. Knight waited a step back, controlled power coiled beneath his thick coat. They were silent, perfectly tuned. Riley Hart waited farther downslope with the Federal team. She stood tall despite the cold auburn braid tucked into her collar, her posture composed and deliberate. The events of the past days had carved something harder into her expression. Not bitterness, but clarity. The team leader, Special Agent Marcus Vaughn, gave a final hand signal. Vaughn was broad-shouldered, mid-40s, his close-cropped hair flecked with gray. Years in the field had given him a reputation for patience and precision. He trusted plans that relied on discipline, not bravado. The convoy rolled, engines idled, then cut, doors opened. The men unloading crates moved with practiced familiarity. This was not their first night operation. At the center of it all stood Ford Mercer. Mercer looked smaller here, stripped of the authority he once carried in offices and briefings. His tailored coat hung stiff on his frame, his face drawn tight with urgency. He barked orders, eyes scanning the ridgeline. Too late. Federal lights ignited in a sudden blaze, voices echoed, sharp and commanding. "Federal agents, drop your weapons!" Chaos erupted. Shots cracked, scattering snow and stone. Evan moved. He slid downslope with controlled speed, boots finding purchase where others would fall. Sable and Knight surged ahead, flanking instinctively, driving attackers away from Riley's position. Sable slammed into one man's legs, knocking him hard into the snow. Knight pinned another with sheer weight, holding him immobile until agents secured him. Mercer saw Riley through the confusion, his eyes fixed on her with desperate calculation. He lunged. Riley raised her weapon, but another figure burst from the smoke between them. Evan intercepted Mercer mid-stride, crashing into him with a force that drove the breath from Mercer's lungs. They hit the ground hard. Mercer clawed for a knife. Evan trapped his wrist, twisted, and struck once. Clean. Decisive. Mercer went still. As agents closed in, Evan turned and froze. A crate had ruptured uphill, slick metal tumbling free. Riley slipped on the ice, sliding toward the zite, edge of a sharp drop. Evan reached her just as her footing gave way. He caught her arm, the jolt wrenching through his shoulder, boots skidding as he dug in. For a suspended heartbeat, the world narrowed to breath and grip. "I've got you," he said, voice steady despite the strain. Riley looked up at him, snow clinging to her lashes. In that instant, the walls she'd kept so carefully in place finally lowered. "I know." He hauled her back, pulling her into him as gunfire faded and commands echoed victory. They stayed there a moment longer than necessary, foreheads nearly touching, the unspoken finally acknowledged. By sunrise, the mine was secured. Harris Cole, the head of Black Timber, was led away in cuffs, his defiance gone, replaced by stunned silence. Crates of chemicals were sealed and marked. Evidence teams moved with methodical efficiency, documenting every violation carved into the mountain. Weeks later, the federal courthouse stood full. The verdicts were swift and unambiguous. Ford Mercer received 32 years in federal prison for treason, chemical trafficking, illegal experimentation, and ecological destruction. Harris Cole was sentenced to life without parole. Their associates faced terms ranging from 15 to 25 years, each judgment read into the record with finality. Justice, measured and unmistakable. At a quiet ceremony outside Cedar Vale, Sable and Knight sat proudly as medals were placed at their collars. Medal of Valor for K9 service, silver catching the winter light. Their tails thumped once, solemn and satisfied. Nora Jennings stood nearby, hands tucked into her coat, eyes bright with emotion. Federal funding had been approved, enough to build the Cedar Vale Animal Rescue and Rehabilitation Center. Plans were already underway. The forest would heal. So would the creatures who depended on it. Not long after, Evan received the call. The voice on the other end was formal, respectful. Options were presented clearly, a return to combat deployment or a transfer to training and development of K9 units for SEAL operations. Evan looked out across the snow-covered valley toward the town below. "I'll take the second," he said. "I'm still serving." The answer came with approval. On a ridge overlooking Cedar Vale, dawn broke in soft gold and pale blue. Evan and Riley stood side by side, shoulders brushing, the cold no longer biting. Below them, the town rested, scarred, but safe. Sable and Knight lay at their feet, relaxed now, finally at ease. Riley slipped her gloved hand into Evan's. He squeezed back, a quiet promise in the gesture. The sun rose higher, spilling warmth across the snow. Hope had survived the storm. In life, darkness rarely announces itself. It hides in silence, in neglect, in the moments when good people are too tired to look closer. But this story reminds us of something timeless. Courage does not belong only to battlefields. It lives in everyday choices. To protect the innocent, to stand when it's easier to walk away, and to remain loyal when betrayal feels inevitable. Like Evan, Riley, Sable, and Knight, we may never face a blizzard or a criminal syndicate. But we all face moments where integrity, compassion, and responsibility are tested. Justice begins when someone refuses to look away. Healing begins when care is given without expecting reward. And hope survives when trust is rebuilt one step at a time. If this story moved you, take a moment to share it with someone who needs a reminder that bravery still exists. Let us know in the comments what part touched you most, or what loyalty and courage mean in your own life. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be told, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, so we can keep sharing moments of resilience, humanity, and hope together.